The train screeched as it slowed into the small rural station of Oklahoma, a thin cloud of smoke drifting above the tracks. The summer sun pressed hard upon the earth, baking the dust into a brittle crust that crunched beneath soldiers' boots. On board the train, behind barred windows, rows of Japanese prisoners of war sat in silence, their uniforms torn and stained by salt water and battle. Among them was Hiroshi Takeda, a 23-year-old naval mechanic who once believed capture would be worse than death. His hands, once steady and skilled with machines, now trembled as he clutched his knees. His mind flooded with rumors that American captors would starve him, beat him or strip him of dignity. As the guards shouted orders, the prisoners were herded off the train. Hiroshi lifted his eyes only enough to glimpse his surroundings. Endless fields of wheat rolling under the wind, and in the distance, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Everything smelled of dust and sweat, so unlike the salty air of his homeland. The Americans kept their rifles ready, but they did not shout insults or strike the men as Hiroshi had expected. Instead, a sergeant barked commands with a firm tone, treating them as soldiers rather than animals. Yet Hiroshi felt no comfort. Fear curled in his stomach like a knot too tight to loosen. If you're finding this story gripping so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the rest of this powerful journey. Inside the camp, the prisoners were lined up and counted. Hiroshi's mind wandered back to the Pacific, to the last desperate battle on a battered destroyer, the thunder of American planes above, the sudden fire, the smoke that drove him into the sea. Survival had brought him here, but survival carried shame. Among his countrymen in the camp, silence hung heavy, broken only by coughs and the shuffle of sandals across gravel. Each man feared not only his captors, but also the judgment of his fellow soldiers, who whispered of dishonor worse than death. The camp itself looked simple. Wooden barracks arranged in rows, a mess hall, and guard towers rising like silent watchmen. The air was dry and hot, cicadas buzzing in the trees beyond the fence. Hiroshi noticed small details that confused him: clean water barrels, latrines that were maintained, and a medical tent with supplies. He had expected filth and neglect, but here he found a strange orderliness. It unsettled him more than cruelty would have, because it clashed with everything he had been told. As the prisoners received their first meal, beans, bread, and weak coffee, Hiroshi hesitated. His pride told him to reject it, but hunger gnawed too deeply. The taste was bland, foreign, yet filling. Around him, some men ate quickly, while others glared at the food, as if swallowing it would betray their homeland. Hiroshi forced it down silently, his mind replaying his mother's voice from distant memory, urging him to endure hardship with dignity. That night, lying on a straw mattress in the barracks, Hiroshi stared at the wooden beams above. Every creak of the building reminded him he was far from home. Whispers in Japanese drifted through the darkness, some men cursing their fate, others muttering prayers. Outside, the sound of guards' boots echoed at steady intervals, a reminder that freedom was now a memory. And yet, a sliver of uncertainty took root within Hiroshi. These Americans, whom he had been told were monsters, had offered water, food, and a bed. Could this be a mask hiding cruelty yet to come, or was there something else at work? He pressed his eyes shut, willing himself to sleep, but questions gnawed at him. Morning would bring routine and labor, but in Hiroshi's heart, unease and curiosity began to wage a quiet war. The enemy was not acting like the beast he had imagined, and the thought disturbed him more than he could admit. Somewhere beyond the fences, life continued with children, families, and churches. What role these would play in the fate of the prisoners, Hiroshi could not yet imagine. But the seeds of an unexpected story had already been planted. The days that followed pressed heavily upon Hiroshi and the men around him. Routine shaped their existence. Wake before dawn, stand in formation under the sharp eyes of American guards, eat, labor, return to barracks. Yet beneath this structure lay a deep undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Every glance at the guards' rifles carried unspoken questions. Would they use them at the first sign of defiance, or were they only symbols of power? Inside the barracks, conversations among prisoners grew tense. Some muttered stories of captured comrades executed in cold blood, tales passed down from men who swore they had seen it with their own eyes. "Americans only pretend to be merciful," one prisoner whispered bitterly. "Soon they will show us what they really are." The words spread like smoke, seeping into Hiroshi's thoughts and feeding his unease. Hiroshi's memories clashed with the present. He had seen American planes deliver destruction, fire swallowing ships whole. The image of sailors leaping into burning seas refused to fade. Could men capable of such devastation also offer kindness without hidden motives? He clenched his fists at night, telling himself that survival depended on caution. Trust, he reasoned, was a weapon too dangerous to hand to the enemy. One afternoon, Lieutenant James Caldwell arrived in the camp yard. A tall man in his late 30s, his uniform pressed, his posture erect, he carried himself with an air of control that demanded attention without raising his voice. The POWs straightened instinctively, though they avoided his eyes. Hiroshi noticed the way Caldwell scanned them, not with cruelty, but as a man weighing responsibility. "Work detail begins tomorrow," Caldwell announced through an interpreter. "You will maintain the grounds, chop wood, and assist with basic repairs. Any disobedience will not be tolerated. Follow orders, and you will be treated fairly." His tone was clipped, practical. He gave no room for defiance, but neither did he spit venom. Afterward, the men argued among themselves. "Fair treatment?" "Lies," one soldier hissed. "They want us docile before they humiliate us." Another shook his head. "Did you not see? He did not insult us. He spoke as though we are men, not animals." Suspicion remained, yet cracks began to appear in the wall of fear. That evening, Hiroshi sat near the corner of the barracks, tracing shapes in the dust with his finger. He recalled his father's words before the war. "A man's enemy can still be a man. Never forget that, even when steel meets steel." At the time, Hiroshi dismissed it as weakness. Now, in captivity, those words returned like a ghost, whispering truths he did not want to hear. Beyond the fences, life in town moved on, though Hiroshi could only sense it faintly. The distant sound of church bells on Sundays, the laughter of children carried on the wind, and once the faint aroma of bread baking from a farmhouse. Each reminder of civilian life sharpened the divide between what he expected, hatred, brutality, and the reality that hinted at something less certain. At night, the guards paced steadily, their boots crunching gravel. One guard, younger than most, occasionally hummed a tune under his breath. Hiroshi found it strange, an enemy humming softly while holding a weapon. It unsettled him more than silence would have, for it reminded him too much of home where his younger sister once sang while cooking rice. Among the prisoners, some began to soften slightly, lowering their voices when guards passed rather than spitting curses, but others hardened further, warning of traps. "Do not forget," one elder soldier growled, "our captors smile while sharpening their knives." Hiroshi lay awake, torn between voices of fear and fleeting moments of doubt. The uncertainty itself became a burden heavier than chains. Each day proved the Americans were not monsters, yet every story from the past screamed otherwise. The war outside the fences raged on, and so too did the war within his own heart. Tomorrow would bring labor under watchful eyes, and with it new questions. Would fairness endure, or was it only a mask waiting to slip? The first days of labor unfolded with a rhythm Hiroshi had not anticipated. At dawn the whistle blew sharp and clear, rousing the men from straw beds. The Oklahoma air carried a dry bite in the morning, crisp with dew, though by noon the sun turned merciless. Prisoners shuffled into line, their shadows stretching long against the earth as guards directed them toward chores. Hiroshi found himself tasked with repairing fences along the perimeter. The work was repetitive, hammering nails into splintered wood, but it demanded precision, something his hands remembered from years working on engines. Sweat rolled down his temples as he pressed each board into place, the smell of sawdust mixing with the dust that clung to every surface. His fellow prisoners muttered under their breath, suspicion still coiled tightly, yet the guards only barked when order slipped. There were no lashes, no beatings, only stern commands. During a break, one soldier whispered, "They are waiting, watching. Do not be fooled." Hiroshi nodded outwardly, but inside he wrestled with doubt. The guards had offered water, passing canteens without insults, and when an older prisoner stumbled under the heat, one American helped steady him. The sight gnawed at Hiroshi's certainty. Were these moments strategy or sincerity? Meals became another daily reminder of contradiction. Plates of beans and cornbread filled the mess hall, simple but plentiful compared to what Hiroshi expected. The first time he bit into the cornbread, its sweetness startled him. Across the table, men forced the food down with grimaces, as though swallowing shame itself. "Eat quickly," one murmured. "They fatten us for some purpose we cannot see." Yet Hiroshi sensed no poison, no trick, only food. His hunger overcame pride, though guilt lingered with every bite. The barracks at night echoed with conflicting voices. Some cursed the Americans in harsh whispers, vowing never to bow their spirit. Others confessed confusion, their beliefs shaken by the lack of cruelty. Hiroshi lay silent, listening, his thoughts pulled in opposite directions. He could not ignore the faint civility of his captors, but admitting it felt like betrayal. Work details expanded beyond fences. The men hauled firewood, stacked supplies, and cleaned the campyard. Hiroshi noticed the order of it all. The Americans insisted on cleanliness, on schedules, on tasks that seemed designed less for punishment and more for discipline. One morning, a guard pointed to Hiroshi's careful workmanship on a fence post and gave a curt nod. No words, no praise, only a gesture. Still, the recognition tightened Hiroshi's chest with something dangerously close to pride. Yet fear did not vanish. Every night, when the floodlights hummed above the wire, Hiroshi imagined the rifles turning toward them, imagined betrayal waiting just beyond tomorrow. He recalled the warnings of comrades back home. "Americans despise us. They despise our emperor. They will strip us of honor." Those words clashed with the rhythm of the camp, where order felt strange but not monstrous. One evening, rain swept across the plains, pounding the barracks roof. Water dripped through cracks, soaking thin blankets. Some men grumbled, others laughed bitterly, but the guards came with tools to patch the leaks. Hiroshi stared as two Americans climbed the roof, hammering even as lightning split the sky. They worked with urgency, not malice, as if they wanted the prisoners dry. It left Hiroshi speechless. Later, as he lay on a damp mattress, a fellow prisoner turned to him. "Takeda, you fix machines. Tell me, are their smiles machines too? Do they run on gears we cannot see?" Hiroshi had no answer. His silence stretched into the night, his mind split between suspicion and a fragile thread of hope he dared not name. The first days revealed not cruelty, but contradictions, a puzzle Hiroshi could not solve. And with each passing dawn, the mystery of his captors deepened, pressing questions heavier than the labor itself. The sun hung low over the Oklahoma plains when Pastor William Carter parked his old truck near the gates of the camp. Dust clung to the tires, rising in clouds as he stepped out, adjusting his hat against the glare. He was a man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with hands roughened by years of farm work as much as ministry. His presence carried both gentleness and gravity, and when he requested a meeting with Lieutenant James Caldwell, the guards hesitated only briefly before allowing him through. Inside the administrative building, the air smelled of tobacco and paper. Caldwell sat behind his desk, his uniform pressed, his expression unreadable. He looked up, gesturing for the pastor to sit. "What brings you here, Reverend?" Caldwell asked, folding his hands. Pastor Carter lowered himself into the chair, taking a moment before answering. "I've been thinking about the men you've got behind those fences, Japanese prisoners. I know what people say about them. Fanatics, killers, cruel. But I also know they're human souls, same as us." Caldwell leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "They are prisoners of war, Pastor. Dangerous men. My duty is to keep them in line, not to worry about their souls." The pastor nodded. "I don't question your duty, Lieutenant, but I believe there's more to this than chains and fences. I'd like to invite them to Sunday services. Let them sit in our church, hear words of peace instead of war. Perhaps it could plant seeds." The request hung heavy in the room. Caldwell's jaw tightened as he considered it. "You realize what you're asking? These men fought against us. Many in town have lost brothers, sons, husbands in the Pacific. They'll see your church doors open to the enemy and call it betrayal. I know the risk, Carter replied softly, but I cannot preach forgiveness and compassion every week, then turn my back when it's hardest. If we are to live by what we claim to believe, it must be shown now, not when it's convenient. For a moment, silence filled the office, broken only by the creak of the chair as Caldwell shifted. You're asking me to put these men into a civilian setting, with families, children, women present. If even one prisoner lashes out, I'll take responsibility, the pastor said firmly. I'll stand beside them myself, look them in the eye, show them they are seen as men, not beasts. Caldwell rubbed his temples, his mind caught between military caution and a respect he couldn't ignore. Finally, he spoke. I won't forbid you, but I won't endorse it either, not yet. If you want this, you'll need to convince more than just me. The people of this town won't welcome it easily. The pastor stood, tipping his hat. Then that will be my task. Thank you for hearing me out. As Carter left the office, Caldwell watched him through the window, his expression unreadable. He had seen men break under captivity, men rage and men resign, but he had never seen someone outside the wire speak of prisoners with such conviction. It unsettled him, though he would never admit it aloud. That night, Carter shared his thoughts with his wife as they sat at the kitchen table, lamplight casting shadows across the walls. If we shut our doors to them, we deny our own faith, he said quietly. His wife, Mary, studied him with steady eyes. Then be prepared, William. This will test not only them, but all of us. Beyond the camp's fences, the bells of the church stood silent, waiting, and though neither Carter nor Caldwell could yet see it, the pastor's proposal would soon challenge every assumption the prisoners carried about their captors, and every fear the townspeople held about their enemies. Word of the pastor's idea reached the prisoners before any official invitation was given. It began as whispers traded across the mess hall, carried by men who had overheard guards speaking among themselves. Soon, the rumor spread through the barracks like wildfire. The Americans wanted the Japanese to attend a church service. For many, the notion felt insulting. A trap, one prisoner spat as he hunched over his tin plate. His name was Nakamura, a veteran with a scar across his cheek and a voice sharp with contempt. They want us to kneel before their foreign god. It is nothing but humiliation dressed as kindness. His words drew murmurs of agreement, heads nodding in anger. Hiroshi listened in silence, pushing food around his plate. A younger soldier beside him whispered, Maybe it is not humiliation. Perhaps they mean to show us something else. Nakamura's eyes flashed. You would shame yourself so easily. Remember who you are. Remember the Emperor. These Americans know only deceit. That night, as rain tapped softly against the barracks roof, the debate deepened. Some prisoners spoke of resisting outright, refusing to step foot in a place of foreign worship. Others, weary of endless suspicion, wondered if there might be no harm in listening. But shame loomed large. What would it mean to stand inside an American church, to hear words not of their ancestors but of an alien faith? Hiroshi lay awake long after the murmurs quieted. His thoughts churned like restless seas. He could almost hear his mother's voice from childhood, reciting prayers before the kamidana, the household altar. Those rituals had bound him to his heritage. To walk into a Christian church now felt like a betrayal of both family and nation. And yet another thought gnawed at him. If the Americans truly wished to humiliate them, why offer food, water, and work instead of cruelty? The contradiction left him torn, caught between loyalty and a fragile curiosity he dared not voice. The next day, Nakamura confronted a group of men outside during labor duty. If they bring this invitation, we will refuse. We will stand together. To attend would mean surrendering our pride. His fist struck his chest as he spoke, his authority carried by the intensity of his conviction. Many nodded, eager to cling to certainty in uncertain times. Later, Hiroshi overheard two guards speaking near the tool shed. One asked the other what he thought of the pastor's idea. "Doesn't sit right with me," the guard muttered. "My brother died in the Pacific. Inviting them into our church feels like spitting on his grave." The words struck Hiroshi harder than Nakamura's threats. The hatred was understandable, born of loss, and yet the guards still carried themselves with restraint. If they truly despised the prisoners, why not lash out instead of allowing this strange possibility? That evening, when Hiroshi returned to the barracks, he found himself the target of a question. A fellow prisoner leaned close and whispered, "Takeda, if they ask us to go, will you?" Hiroshi hesitated, his throat dry. The silence that followed was answer enough. He could feel the eyes of others upon him, judging, measuring. He forced out a reply, "I will do what is required." But in his chest the answer remained uncertain. Fear cloaked the camp like fog. Fear of humiliation, fear of dishonor, fear of the unknown kindness that might be worse than open cruelty. For Hiroshi, the conflict pressed deeper each day, an invisible weight that neither labor nor sleep could ease. And though no official word had come, every man knew the moment would arrive soon, and when it did, choices would be demanded of them all. The morning of the visit dawned with a strange stillness, the kind that presses heavily on the chest before a storm. Hiroshi rose from his cot to find his comrades whispering nervously, adjusting their uniforms as though they were preparing for inspection rather than worship. The guards assembled them in rows, rifles slung across shoulders, eyes watchful, but not cruel. Orders were brief. A select group of prisoners would attend a church service in town under close supervision. No one dared move until directed. Hiroshi's name was called. His stomach twisted as he stepped forward, feeling the weight of dozens of stares. Nakamura's glare burned into him, sharp with accusation. "Do not forget who you are," he muttered under his breath, a warning disguised as advice. Hiroshi said nothing, but his silence carried the burden of divided loyalty. The group marched through the gates, the sound of boots on gravel echoing in the morning air. Beyond the barbed wire, Hiroshi saw the open fields stretch endlessly, dotted with barns and the occasional farmhouse. It was the first time he had left the confines of the camp, and every detail felt overwhelming. The scent of freshly cut hay, the distant bark of a dog, the gentle creak of a windmill turning in the breeze. All of it reminded him that life continued beyond the fences, untouched by the war that had consumed his world. When they reached the church, Hiroshi's heart pounded against his ribs. The building was modest, white paint weathered by sun and rain, its steeple rising simply toward the sky. A bell hung above, still and silent, though its presence alone carried authority. The prisoners were ushered inside, the wooden doors groaning as they swung open. The interior smelled of pine and candle wax. Rows of pews stretched neatly toward the altar, and the stained glass windows glowed with colors Hiroshi had never seen arranged this way, reds and blues bending sunlight into patterns across the floor. He stood frozen for a moment, the unfamiliar beauty unsettling him more than bars and rifles ever had. The congregation was already seated. Men and women in their Sunday best turned as the prisoners entered, their gazes sharp with suspicion. Some mouths tightened, others whispered behind hands. Children stared openly, their eyes wide with curiosity and something close to fear. The air thickened with tension, silence louder than words. Hiroshi felt it press against his skin, each step heavier than the last. Pastor Carter greeted them at the entrance with a calm nod. "Welcome," he said simply, his voice steady, neither condemning nor patronizing. Though Hiroshi barely understood the words, the tone carried weight. He bowed his head slightly, unsure why, but the gesture came instinctively. The guards directed the prisoners to sit in a cluster near the back. Hiroshi slid onto the wooden pew, the surface hard beneath him, the air tinged with a faint sweetness from hymnals worn by countless hands. He could hear the congregation shifting, clearing throats, a rustle of discomfort filling the silence before the service began. When the first hymn rose, the sound startled him. Voices swelled together, some trembling, some strong, filling the church with harmony that echoed in Hiroshi's chest. He did not know the words, yet the melody stirred something he could not name. Longing, perhaps, or the ache of distance from home. He caught the eye of a young girl across the aisle, who studied him with innocent curiosity rather than fear. For a fleeting moment, he felt seen not as an enemy but as a man. Still unease clung to him. He could sense resentment simmering among the townsfolk, their grief and anger barely contained beneath polite silence. He wondered if at any moment hostility might erupt. Yet no stones were thrown, no insults hurled. Only the weight of suspicion remained, sharp but restrained. As the service continued, Hiroshi sat rigid, torn between the warning of his comrades and the strange, fragile possibility that kindness could exist even here. The tension was far from broken, but the first crack had appeared, and he could not ignore it. The service carried on with a rhythm foreign to Hiroshi, yet oddly soothing. Pastor Carter's voice filled the small church, steady and deliberate, the cadence of his words rising and falling like waves. Hiroshi could not understand most of what was said, but the tone struck him as more gentle than commanding. It was not the voice of an enemy officer demanding obedience, but of a man offering something softer, something he could not yet name. The hymnals were passed down the pews, their covers worn from countless hands. A guard placed one carefully on the bench beside Hiroshi. He did not touch it at first, unsure if opening it would mean surrendering to something foreign. Then he noticed a boy no older than 10 craning his neck to see the Japanese prisoners, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. The boy clutched his hymnal close, lips moving as he sang. Hiroshi, caught in the child's gaze, felt the faintest crack in the wall he had built around himself. He reached for the book, opened it, and let his eyes trace the incomprehensible words while the melody swelled around him. When communion bread was passed, the tension in the room sharpened. The congregation received it solemnly, one by one. The pastor then turned toward the prisoners and hesitated only briefly before extending the tray in their direction. The guards shifted, watching closely. Some prisoners lowered their eyes, refusing to move. Others stiffened, unsure. Hiroshi hesitated, his hand trembling, then stopped himself. To accept would feel like betrayal, to refuse a declaration of defiance. He bowed his head slightly, neither accepting nor rejecting, caught in a space between. Mary Carter, the pastor's daughter, moved quietly through the aisle with a basket of hymnals. She was perhaps 19, her face framed by dark hair, her expression calm but curious. When she reached the back pew where the prisoners sat, her gaze lingered on Hiroshi. For the briefest moment their eyes met. She offered a faint smile, not bold, not pitying, but simple recognition. Hiroshi looked away quickly, heat rising to his face, his heart thudding uncomfortably. After the service ended, the congregation filed out slowly, murmuring to one another. Hiroshi caught fragments of tone, if not words, suspicion, disapproval, but also restraint. No one shouted, no one spat. The townsfolk cast glances like daggers, yet they left quietly. The prisoners were led outside, the sunlight blinding after the dim glow of stained glass. As they marched back to camp, the men whispered among themselves. "It was nothing but theater," Nakamura muttered bitterly. "They parade us in front of their people, show us their god, then claim they have been merciful." Another scoffed. "It was propaganda, nothing more." Hiroshi walked in silence, but his mind replayed the service in vivid fragments. The sound of voices rising together, the curious eyes of a child, the soft smile of Mary Carter. None of it fit the image of cruelty he had been taught to expect. The contradictions left him uneasy, as though the ground beneath his beliefs had shifted slightly. That evening, lying on his cot, he stared at the rafters and tried to push the thoughts away. Yet the memory of the hymn lingered in his chest, stubborn and uninvited. He whispered to himself in Japanese, almost like a prayer, though he could not tell if he was asking for clarity or simply trying to hold on to something familiar. The camp buzzed with debate long into the night. Some prisoners swore they would never return, others admitted grudging curiosity. For Hiroshi, the question was no longer about whether the Americans intended cruelty. It was about whether he could allow himself to see humanity where he had been taught to see only enemies. And that question, heavier than any chain, followed him into uneasy sleep. Back inside the wire, the prisoners returned to their routines, yet the memory of the church visit refused to fade. Whispers threaded through the barracks, rising at night when the guards' footsteps grew distant. Nakamura spoke with venom. "Do you not see? They toy with us. They show their women and children to make us believe they are merciful. It is weakness disguised as strength." His words carried conviction, and many nodded, eager to hold on to suspicion. Another prisoner, a thin man named Saito, spoke quietly but firmly. "And yet, Nakamura, no insult was thrown, no stone raised. They let us sit among them as equals, if only for an hour." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Does that not trouble you? That they could treat us so differently from what we imagined?" Nakamura's jaw clenched. "Do not be deceived. They soften us for their purposes. The moment we forget our honor, we are already defeated." The barracks fell into divided murmurs. Some echoed Nakamura's warnings, others admitted unease. Hiroshi remained silent, listening, his thoughts tangled. The memory of Mary Carter's faint smile lingered in his mind, unsettling him more than Nakamura's threats. It had not been propaganda, not a calculated trick. It had felt too small, too human. Later, while repairing a section of fence with other prisoners, Hiroshi overheard a guard speaking with another in English. He caught only fragments. "Pastor Carter, controversy, town not pleased." Though the words slipped past his understanding, the tone told enough. The Americans too argued among themselves. They were not united in cruelty or mercy. They wrestled with doubts, just as the prisoners did. That evening, the conversation in the barracks shifted again. Saito turned to Hiroshi. "Takeda, you are quiet. What do you think of the church?" Hiroshi hesitated. His comrades leaned closer, waiting. He chose his words with care. "I expected hatred. I saw suspicion, yes, but also restraint." "It confuses me." Nakamura barked a laugh, bitter and sharp. "Confusion is dangerous. That is exactly what they want, for you to question yourself until you forget who you are." But Saito leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Or perhaps confusion means truth is not as simple as we were told. Have you considered that?" The barracks grew tense. The prisoners shifted uncomfortably, caught between two poles, fear of betrayal and the spark of something they dared not name. Hiroshi lowered his gaze, unwilling to take a side. His heart pounded, ashamed of his uncertainty, yet unable to silence it. That night, sleep eluded him. He stared at the rafters while the others snored. The sound of the hymn returned unbidden, mingling with the memory of the child's wide eyes. He whispered into the darkness, "If they are not what we were told, then what am I to believe?" No answer came, only the steady hum of the floodlights outside. Days passed and labor filled their hours, but conversations circled back to the church. Some clung fiercely to distrust, their pride shielding them from doubt. Others grew quieter, thoughtful, unwilling to dismiss what they had witnessed. The division unsettled Hiroshi more than open hostility would have, for it revealed cracks within their unity, cracks that mirrored his own inner conflict. One evening, while drawing water from the barrel, Saito approached Hiroshi in a low voice. "If they invite us again, will you go?" Hiroshi froze, staring at the ripples in the water. He wanted to say no, to declare loyalty, but the word caught in his throat. At last he whispered, "I do not know." Saito nodded slowly, as though the answer confirmed something within himself. "Neither do I." The uncertainty bound them in silence, heavier than chains. Around them, suspicion still thrived, but curiosity had taken root. It was fragile, unwelcome, yet alive, an unspoken question growing louder with each passing day. By late summer, the Oklahoma sun burned relentlessly, turning the fields golden and the air heavy with heat. The camp's routine shifted as local farmers requested labor, and groups of prisoners were escorted beyond the barbed wire to assist with harvest and repairs. For Hiroshi, it was the first time he had walked freely, though still under guard, into the wider rhythm of American life. The group was assigned to a farm just beyond town. The land stretched wide, with rows of corn standing tall, their leaves whispering under the wind. The smell of earth and hay was thick in the air, mingled with the distant lowing of cattle. Hiroshi carried tools across his shoulder, the weight familiar, though the setting felt surreal. He had been trained to repair warships, to fight machines of iron and fire. Now he stood in a field of grain, asked only to mend fences and clear brush. The farmer, a stocky man with sun-browned skin and a wary gaze, watched closely as the prisoners worked. His name, Hiroshi soon learned through the interpreter, was Mr. Miller. At first, his stance was rigid, his jaw tight as though each movement of the prisoners confirmed his distrust. But necessity pressed harder than fear. Crops needed tending, repairs demanded hands, and he had lost 2 sons to the war, one in Europe, one in the Pacific. Hiroshi sensed the man's grief even without words. When Miller's eyes lingered on them, sorrow mingled with suspicion. Yet Miller did not curse or spit. Instead, he directed with terse gestures, his voice low as though speaking too much would betray his own anger. As the hours passed, Hiroshi's skill revealed itself. When a tractor broke down, its engine coughing and sputtering, the farmer muttered in frustration. Hiroshi stepped closer, his hands itching with the instinct to act. Through the interpreter, he offered, "I can repair machines." The guard hesitated but finally nodded. Kneeling beside the tractor, Hiroshi examined the parts, his fingers moving with certainty. The work steadied him, each bolt and wire reminding him of the docks back home. Sweat dripped into his eyes, dust clung to his arms, but the engine roared back to life under his care. The sound drew startled looks. Mr. Miller froze, then approached slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. He studied Hiroshi for a long moment before speaking. "Thank you," he said plainly. The words carried through the interpreter, but clear enough in tone. Hiroshi bowed his head, muttering softly in Japanese, unsure how to respond. The gratitude in Miller's voice unsettled him, not because it was hostile, but because it was genuine. Back at the barracks that night, Hiroshi replayed the moment. His comrades pressed him for details. "You helped them," Nakamura demanded, eyes flashing. "You fixed their war machine?" Hiroshi answered quietly, "It was not a war machine. It was a farmer's tractor. It feeds his family." Silence followed, heavy and uncomfortable. Some shook their heads, others avoided his gaze, but Saito leaned closer, whispering so only Hiroshi could hear. "And how did it feel?" Hiroshi's voice caught before he admitted, "It felt human." The following days brought more work beyond the fence. The rhythm of labor shifted from punishment to necessity. Prisoners hauled hay, repaired barns, dug trenches. The Americans watched closely, but small gestures slipped through. A farmer offering water from his jug, a child peeking shyly from a doorway, a nod of acknowledgement when the work was well done. Each moment carved small cracks in the wall of hatred Hiroshi had been taught to carry, yet every kindness brought new fear. To accept it felt like betrayal. To deny it felt dishonest. As Hiroshi lay awake, the distant hum of cicadas filling the night, he realized trust was no longer an abstract idea. It was creeping into his life, fragile but persistent, growing in the most unlikely soil. Pastor Carter knew the unease his proposal had stirred, yet he had not anticipated the weight of opposition that followed. Word of the Japanese prisoners attending service spread quickly through the town, carried on porch conversations, muttered in the general store, repeated with sharper edges in the barbershop. By the following Sunday, the air felt charged, every step down the main street lined with eyes that judged him silently. One evening, the church council gathered in the modest hall adjoining the sanctuary. The room smelled of coffee and wood polish, the long table scarred by years of meetings. Deacons and elders filled the seats, their faces drawn and serious. Carter opened the meeting with prayer, but when he lifted his eyes, he met only stern gazes. "William," began Mr. Harris, an elder with silver hair and a voice gravelly with age, "we've supported you through many years. But this business of bringing the enemy into our sanctuary, this goes too far." Others nodded in agreement. A farmer leaned forward, his hands rough from field work. "My boy is fighting in the Pacific right now. How do you think it feels, seeing the very men he battles welcomed into the house of God?" "It dishonors his sacrifice." Carter folded his hands on the table, his tone calm though his heart raced. "I understand your pain. I understand your anger. But the gospel does not draw borders. It commands us to love even our enemies." A murmur swept through the room. One man slammed his palm on the table. "Love our enemies." These men killed our sons, bombed our ships, dragged us into this war. And you would have us break bread with them? Carter met his gaze without flinching. Yes, because to love when it is easy proves nothing. It is only when it costs us that love becomes true. The silence that followed was heavy. Harris shook his head slowly. You ask too much, William. The town will not stand for it. That week, whispers turned sharper. Some townsfolk crossed the street rather than greet him. A woman who once brought pies after Sunday service now avoided his eyes. His wife, Mary, saw the toll it took. At night, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. You knew this would come, she said softly. The question is whether you can endure it. Carter sighed, staring at the lamplight flickering across the walls. I fear I will lose them, Mary. Not just their support, but their trust. She looked at him steadily. If you lose them for the sake of what is right, then perhaps you will gain something greater. Meanwhile, in the camp, the prisoners spoke of the pastor with equal parts suspicion and wonder. Some scoffed, calling him a hypocrite who preached mercy while his people waged war. Others, recalling the warmth of his greeting, admitted confusion. Hiroshi thought often of the man's voice, not understanding the words but sensing their weight. Was it possible that such conviction could be false? One afternoon, Carter returned to the camp to speak with Caldwell again. The lieutenant stood outside the barracks, hat shading his eyes. You've stirred up quite a storm, Caldwell remarked dryly. Carter smiled faintly. Storms come before new growth. Caldwell studied him for a long moment. You realize, if this goes wrong, it won't just be you paying the price. It'll be those men too. The town is angry, and anger doesn't always stop at words. I know, Carter said quietly, but I cannot close the door now. Not when it has already been opened. As he left, the guards resumed their steady patrol, the dust swirling beneath their boots. In town and in camp alike, questions grew sharper, tensions heavier. Yet the pastor remained resolute, even as the weight of resistance threatened to break him. The next invitation to the church came quietly, delivered by a guard who read the order aloud in clipped English before handing it to the interpreter. A small group of prisoners would once again attend Sunday service. Unlike the first time, fewer objections were raised. Some men, though still wary, no longer spat their defiance so quickly. Suspicion remained, but curiosity began to creep into the cracks. Hiroshi felt his pulse quicken when his name was listed. Nakamura muttered under his breath, but the venom had dulled. Go, if you must, he said coldly, but remember, you carry shame with every step. Hiroshi bowed his head, neither accepting nor rejecting the accusation, and joined the others. The second visit unfolded with less tension. The congregation still watched with guarded eyes, but the shock of the prisoner's presence had faded into uneasy tolerance. The pews creaked as Hiroshi settled once again at the back, the wooden hymnal resting in his lap. When the music began, he dared to hum along softly, not words but melody. The sound vibrated in his chest, strange and unsteady, yet not unwelcome. After service, as the prisoners waited to be escorted out, Mary Carter approached again, her steps tentative but deliberate. She carried a small notebook and pencil. Holding them out, she spoke carefully, enunciating each word. English one for you. Hiroshi blinked, startled. His hands hovered before he accepted the gift, bowing slightly. Arigato, he murmured, the Japanese word slipping out instinctively. Mary tilted her head, a faint smile flickering across her face. She repeated softly, Thank you. For the first time, Hiroshi heard the phrase not as a command in English, but as a bridge. Back in the barracks, the notebook drew attention. Some mocked it. You will learn their tongue now? Will you sing their songs too? One man sneered. Hiroshi closed the book quietly and placed it under his straw mattress. He did not argue, but the gesture left him unsettled. Shame whispered in his ear, yet curiosity burned stronger. That night he traced the letters in the dim light, copying them slowly, clumsily, whispering the sounds to himself. The following week, during work detail, Hiroshi tested a word aloud while carrying tools. Water, he said hesitantly, glancing toward a guard. The guard raised an eyebrow, then nodded. Water, he repeated, handing over the canteen. The exchange was simple, but it rippled through Hiroshi like a current. Not all prisoners approved. Nakamura confronted him that evening, his voice sharp. Every time you open your mouth in their language, you betray your own. Do you not see how they are changing you? Hiroshi met his glare, his voice calm but firm. Perhaps they are not changing me. Perhaps I am simply seeing. The tension between them lingered, heavy and dangerous. Yet others quietly approached Hiroshi with questions. "What word did she teach you?" Saito asked, his eyes wide with something like hope. Hiroshi showed him the letters, guiding his finger across the page. Together they stumbled through the sounds, their whispers mingling with the creak of the barracks at night. Small gestures began to shape the days. When the prisoners attended church again, some picked up hymnals willingly. A few even attempted to mimic the sounds, their voices awkward but sincere. The congregation still stared, but the atmosphere shifted, fewer hostile whispers, more curious glances. Trust was fragile, fragile as glass, but it existed where before there had been only walls. Hiroshi sensed the change within himself most clearly when he caught sight of Mary again. She did not smile boldly, nor did she linger, but her nod, brief and respectful, anchored him. For the first time since capture, he felt less like a prisoner and more like a man walking a narrow bridge between two worlds. And though that bridge trembled beneath him, Hiroshi knew he could not turn back. By autumn, the tension inside the barracks had hardened into sharp lines. The prisoners were no longer united in their silence. Instead, they were divided into camps. Those who clung fiercely to suspicion, and those whose curiosity about the Americans had grown too strong to ignore. The air carried the weight of this division, every glance a test of loyalty, every word a potential betrayal. Nakamura stood at the center of resistance. His scarred face and fiery speeches rallied men who feared dishonor more than hunger. "They want to break us," he declared one night, his voice carrying through the dim barracks. "Every hymn you hum, every word of English you speak, every smile you return, it is surrender. And surrender is death of the spirit." His words drew murmurs of approval, heads nodding as shame pricked hearts already uncertain. Hiroshi sat quietly, the small notebook hidden beneath his mattress like contraband. He felt Nakamura's eyes burn into him, sharp with accusation. At last Nakamura spoke his name aloud. "Takeda, you would trade our honor for their kindness. Do you deny it?" The barracks fell silent. Hiroshi lifted his gaze, his throat tight. "I have accepted no chains beyond those already on my wrists," he said softly. "I only seek to understand." A soldier beside Nakamura spat on the floor. "Understanding the enemy is betrayal." But Saito spoke up, his voice trembling yet firm. "Perhaps understanding is survival. Perhaps it is even strength." The exchange ignited murmurs, louder this time, as the barracks split. Hiroshi felt his chest tighten. He had not wanted to be a leader, but the choice was forced upon him. To deny his curiosity would be a lie. To admit it was to risk isolation. Days later, the conflict nearly erupted into violence. While working on the farm fields, Nakamura confronted Hiroshi directly, shoving him hard against the fence. The guards shouted but did not intervene at once, their rifles held low. "You shame us all," Nakamura hissed. "Every step you take toward them is a step away from home." Hiroshi steadied himself, his hands gripping the wooden post. His voice rose louder than he intended. "Home is already gone, do you not see? We are here behind their fences, eating their bread, breathing their air. If we cannot find a way to live with it, we will die in spirit before the war ever ends." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Nakamura's fist trembled at his side, but he did not strike. Instead, he spat on the ground and turned away, his silence more dangerous than rage. The guards finally stepped in, herding the men back into order. That night the barracks felt colder. Hiroshi sat alone, tracing the letters in his notebook by the dim glow of a lantern. Each word felt heavier, burdened with meaning beyond language. He wondered if he had crossed a line from which he could not return. Saito approached quietly, crouching beside him. "You spoke truth," he whispered. "Others heard it even if they fear to admit it." "But at what cost?" Hiroshi murmured, his voice cracked with doubt. "I have made enemies of my own countrymen." Saito's reply was steady. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you have shown them that survival does not mean dishonor. Time will tell." Hiroshi closed the notebook, pressing it to his chest. Fear gnawed at him, not of the Americans, but of the fracture within his own people. The enemy outside the wire was visible, predictable. The enemy within the barracks was far more dangerous, for it wore familiar faces and spoke in the language of home. As he lay awake, the hum of cicadas blending with the distant toll of a church bell, Hiroshi realized the war had carved itself into their hearts. The true battle was no longer fought with rifles or ships, but with pride, fear, and the fragile hope of something different. The chill of October settled over the plains, the wind carrying with it the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke. The prisoners rose each morning to the same routine, but beneath the surface the camp's spirit felt brittle, as though one sharp word might shatter it completely. Then news arrived that pierced deeper than any argument. Through the interpreter, the guards relayed that American forces had pushed further across the Pacific, battles fierce and costly. The words were plain, but the weight behind them was not. Several Japanese cities had been bombed and losses were heavy. The prisoners exchanged glances, their faces carved with grief they could not voice aloud. For many, the announcement confirmed their worst fears. Families back home might already be gone. That evening, Hiroshi sat outside the barracks during a brief pause in duties, staring at the horizon where the sun bled crimson into the clouds. Saito joined him, his face pale. "My brother served on a destroyer," he said softly. "If the Americans tell the truth, then he is likely dead." His voice cracked, and for a moment he covered his eyes with his hands, shoulders trembling. Hiroshi placed a hand on his arm, but found no words. His own thoughts had turned to his mother and sister, their small home by the docks in Yokohama. Had the bombs reached them too? The not knowing was its own torture. 2 days later, a letter arrived for one of the guards, a young man barely older than Hiroshi. He read it quietly during his break, then folded it with trembling fingers. His friend leaned over, murmuring, "I'm sorry." The young guard nodded stiffly, blinking hard, then stood and resumed patrol, though his face was pale with grief. Word spread quickly among the prisoners. The guard's brother had been killed in Europe. The realization struck Hiroshi like a blow. Here was an enemy who carried the same sorrow he did. That night, while the barracks murmured with restless dreams, Hiroshi whispered to Saito, "Do you see, they grieve as we grieve." Saito nodded slowly. Loss does not wear a uniform. The following Sunday, the prisoners once again attended service. The atmosphere was heavy, not with hostility, but with mourning. The congregation sang hymns slower, voices subdued, as though each note carried the weight of absent loved ones. Pastor Carter spoke of loss, his voice steady but raw. Though Hiroshi could not grasp the words, he felt the sorrow in every syllable. When the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, Hiroshi lowered his too, not out of faith, but solidarity. He thought of his father's words long ago, "A man's enemy can still be a man." For the first time, Hiroshi felt those words take root within him. After the service, as the congregation filed out, the young guard whose brother had died lingered near the back. His eyes met Hiroshi's briefly. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, the guard gave a nod, not of friendship, but of recognition. Hiroshi returned it, his heart tight. Back in the barracks, Nakamura mocked those who spoke of compassion. "Their grief is not our concern. Do not let sentiment blind you." But his voice lacked its old fire. Even he could not deny the weight of shared loss. Hiroshi lay awake that night, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the barracks wall. The distance between captor and captive had narrowed, not through speeches or orders, but through pain both carried in silence. Loss had stripped away the lies of propaganda and revealed something undeniable. The suffering of one side mirrored the suffering of the other. It was a fragile connection, unspoken yet real, and it began to change how Hiroshi saw the world beyond the wire. Winter crept slowly across the plains, the once golden fields now lying bare beneath a pale sky. Frost rimmed the fence posts at dawn, and the prisoners huddled deeper into their coats during roll call. Yet beneath the cold, something warmer had begun to stir inside the camp. The men no longer looked at every invitation to church as a trap. Some even anticipated it with quiet eagerness. Hiroshi noticed the change most clearly in small gestures. When hymnals were handed out, several prisoners accepted them without hesitation. A few even attempted to sound the words, their accents heavy but sincere. The congregation, though still cautious, no longer shifted uncomfortably at their presence. Instead, there were hesitant nods, brief greetings exchanged at the church doors. One Sunday, as the congregation sang, Hiroshi let his voice rise softly, matching the melody if not the words. At first it felt awkward, his throat tight with self-consciousness. But as the notes blended with those around him, something within him loosened. He was not singing as a Japanese soldier, nor as a prisoner, but simply as a man lending his voice to others. After the service, Mary Carter approached once more, the notebook in her hand now filled with new words. She flipped to a page and pointed. "Friend," she said, clear and deliberate. Hiroshi repeated it, stumbling slightly. "Friend." She smiled gently and corrected, "Friend." Saito leaned over, curious. "What does it mean?" he asked in Japanese. Hiroshi hesitated, then answered softly, "Tomo." The word lingered between them, fragile as glass yet powerful enough to shift the air. In the barracks, the notebook passed from hand to hand. Men who once mocked Hiroshi now studied the letters with furtive interest. They whispered words under their breath, awkward, stumbling, but filled with determination. Nakamura still scoffed, but his voice no longer carried the same authority. His warnings of dishonor sounded hollow against the quiet eagerness of men reaching for something new. Trust seeped slowly beyond the church walls. During work details, farmers began to speak more openly, sometimes even with gratitude. When a fence was mended or a load of hay stacked neatly, a nod or a quiet thank you bridged the gap between captor and captive. Hiroshi found himself answering with broken English, the words clumsy but honest. Each exchange chipped away at the iron barrier of suspicion. One afternoon, while repairing a barn roof, Hiroshi paused to catch his breath. "Mr." Miller, the farmer whose tractor he had fixed months earlier, handed him a canteen. "Good work," Miller said simply. The words needed no translation. Hiroshi bowed his head, his chest tightening with an emotion he struggled to name. That evening the barracks buzzed with quiet energy. Men compared the new words they had learned, some laughing at their own mistakes, others repeating syllables until they rolled smoother from their tongues. Hiroshi listened, pride and fear warring within him. What they were building was fragile, easily shattered. Yet it was real, undeniable. Later, Saito turned to him and whispered, "Takeda, do you ever think, when this war ends, we might return home changed forever?" Hiroshi stared at the frost creeping along the window. "I think we already are." For the first time since his capture, he did not feel ashamed of the thought. The transformation was not betrayal. It was survival, growth, and something deeper he had yet to understand. As the nights grew longer and the air colder, Hiroshi sensed that the bridge between enemies had become something stronger. No longer cracks in a wall, but the beginnings of a path. Fragile, uncertain, yet leading toward a truth he could no longer deny. Spring returned to the plains, carrying with it a sense of change that even the barbed wire could not contain. Rumors spread quickly through the camp. The war was ending. Each whisper carried both relief and dread. For some it meant going home, though no one knew what home would look like now. For others, it meant facing families after the shame of capture. For Hiroshi, it meant leaving behind the strange, fragile bond he had found in a place he once thought would break him. The day of departure arrived quietly. The prisoners lined up with their few belongings, guarded as always, yet the mood was different. There was no bark of cruelty, no tension like in the first days. The Americans stood watchful, but many faces held something softer, a recognition that the men before them were no longer faceless enemies. Hiroshi carried the worn notebook Mary had given him, its pages filled with words scribbled by uncertain hands. As he tucked it safely inside his coat, he caught sight of Pastor Carter waiting near the edge of the yard. The pastor stepped forward, nodding to the guards before addressing the prisoners. "You go now," Carter said, his voice steady, the interpreter echoing his words in Japanese. "But remember, you have been seen not only as soldiers but as men. Carry that truth with you." The prisoners stood silent, the weight of his words pressing deeply. Hiroshi felt his chest tighten, and before he could stop himself, he bowed low. Slowly, others followed, the gesture unspoken yet unanimous. Carter bowed his head in return, his eyes shining with quiet conviction. Mary approached shyly, her hands clasped around a small package. She looked directly at Hiroshi, then extended it. "For you," she said softly. Inside was a folded piece of cloth, embroidered with a single word, "Friend." Hiroshi's throat closed as he accepted it, bowing again. "Thank you," he whispered in English, the word trembling but clear. On the journey back to the port, Hiroshi stared out the truck window as fields rolled past, the familiar sound of cicadas buzzing in the warm air. He thought of Mr. Miller's nod of respect, of Saito repeating English words by lantern light, of Nakamura's fierce warnings softened by time. Most of all he thought of the hymns, the sound of voices blending, carrying sorrow and hope in equal measure. When the prisoners finally boarded the ship bound for Japan, Hiroshi felt a mix of dread and anticipation. Home awaited, but so did questions. Would his family still live? Would they see him as dishonored, or would they understand what he had carried across the ocean? He clutched the notebook and the cloth tightly, talismans not of victory or defeat, but of humanity discovered in the unlikeliest of places. Standing on deck as the shoreline receded, Hiroshi whispered to Saito, "Do you think they will remember us?" Saito's gaze followed the horizon. "Perhaps. But more important, will we remember them?" The waves stretched endlessly, carrying them toward an uncertain future, yet within Hiroshi's heart something had shifted forever. He no longer saw the Americans solely as captors or enemies. He saw them as men who grieved, who sang, who offered kindness even when the world demanded hatred. War had brought him across the ocean in chains. But compassion, fragile and stubborn, had given him something to carry back. The truth that humanity could endure even in the darkest places. And so, as the ship cut across the waters, Hiroshi held that truth tightly, knowing it would guide him long after the war had ended. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful journeys through history. And make sure to click on the suggested video now appearing on your screen. You won't want to miss where the next story takes us.